So what does the face diet mean? You'll hear me throw this term out there a lot. So when I say face diet, I mean the stream of faces the brain takes in every day. The people at home, at work, in traffic, on your phone, on TV, in stores. Your brain is constantly processing people and faces. And over time, it creates a visual routine, a pattern of what feels normal and familiar. And that is what makes the face diet research so useful. It gives us a more realistic picture of how people actually experience faces in everyday life. Again, the study found that 75% of face exposure was to familiar faces, and 44% was to three-quarter views. It's also found that faces were relatively large in daily experience, with the median visual angle of 6 degrees, which suggests a lot of face exposure happens at socially normal, fairly close distances. Now, apply that to the PI market. What happens when one lawyer's face shows up on the interstate, on surface streets, on TV, online, in your social feeds just over and over and over again? That person starts to feel familiar. Not personally known, but visually known. And that matters because familiarity lowers friction. It makes someone easier to recognize, easier to remember, and easier to retrieve later. That is why I think a lot of the firms misunderstand what high-frequency face-based advertising is doing. They think it's just louder advertising. Sometimes it is, but at its best, it is building a repeated sense of, I know who that is. And that's the major shift here. People will not describe it as research language. They will just say, I've seen that guy everywhere, or they are the first name I thought of. And that is the face diet at work. And that is exactly what I saw in practice. When you place enough media across enough of a market, especially in a smaller or mid-sized market where domination is actually achievable, people stop reacting to the advertiser like a campaign and start reacting to them like a known local presence. And that is a very different kind of advantage. Now let's talk a little bit why the face diet matters in personal injury. Ultimately, it matters in any category, but especially in personal injury because of the conditions under which the decision gets made. Nobody wants to shop for a lawyer after a wreck. They want clarity, they want confidence, and they want the next step that feels safe. That is where familiarity becomes such an advantage. If someone has seen your face, your name, your colors, your slogan, and your phone number for months, years, or even decades, then when they need a lawyer, you are not starting from scratch. You already have one of the hardest hurdles cleared. You're already in the consideration set. This is where the broader psychology supports what we see in the market. It's called the mere exposure effect, the idea that repeated exposure increases liking or preference. It has been examined in more than 400 published studies. There is also the fluency side of this. Research on the illusory truth effect shows that repetition can make information easier to process, and that ease can influence how familiar or believable something feels. I want to be careful not to overstate that. Repetition does not automatically create trust. A billboard does not magically make someone credible, but repeated exposure does change how a person is processed and perceived. It can make them feel more familiar, more available in memory, and easier to choose under pressure, which is important in the PI world. That is why I think people often ask the wrong question. They ask, did that billboard generate a call? Sometimes the better question is, did the billboard make the brand more familiar and work in conjunction with all my other marketing efforts? Because if it did, then it may pay off later in search and branded traffic and referral conversations, or in the moment when someone says, who is that lawyer I always see on the highway? That familiarity compounds, eventually exponentially. Once the firm reaches a certain level of recognition, the next impression works harder because it builds on memory that already exists. And that is where my own experience really shaped how I think about this. When I was in-house, we were not just trying to check the box on media efficiency. We were trying to become unavoidable. We had already satisfied the normal planning logic. Then we kept layering on top of that. That is when it stopped being just about the media delivery and started becoming about mental occupation. And that is a very different strategy.